Welcome to Newcastle Family History Society podcasts. The Newcastle Family History Society, located on Awabakal land in Newcastle, New South Wales, Australia, provides support for those interested in family history. And welcome to this special two-part series, Second World War Links Between Newcastle and Portuguese Timor, a forgotten story, presented by historian Dr Jude Conway. In this remarkable account, we uncover a little-known chapter of wartime history, one that spans the jungles of Timor, the city streets of Newcastle, and a camouflaged refugee camp at Bob's Farm. Through gripping detail and powerful personal stories, Dr Conway reveals how Australian commandos, Portuguese bureaucrats, soldiers and exiles, and Timorese villagers were drawn together in a complex web of resistance, survival and solidarity. From daring guerrilla raids to the humanitarian effort that followed, this is a story of courage, displacement and unexpected connections, one that still echoes in our region today.
The tiny nation of Timor-Leste, lying in the Indonesian archipelago 1 hour's flight northwest of Darwin, holds a special spot in the heart of many Australians who watched their epic struggle for freedom from occupation by Indonesia and their vote for independence in a United Nations consultation in 1999. So it is a surprise to most people to learn that in World War II, when Timor-Leste was still a Portuguese colony, links were forged between Portuguese Timor and Newcastle in the Hunter Valley. For a start, there were Novocastrians among the Australian commandos who, together with Dutch troops, invaded the colony in 1942 and fought daringly in the mountainous country against the Japanese once they followed the Allies in. After a year of guerrilla warfare, the commandos had to be evacuated, and they were accompanied by hundreds of locals. Consequently, the most important link to Newcastle is that for 15 months, 540 of these evacuees from Portuguese Timor were accommodated at a camp at Bob's Farm, only 30 kilometres northwest of the Newcastle suburb of Stockton. This camp was to play a role in international relations between Australia and Portugal, between the evacuees and Hunter region communities, and between Newcastle and Portuguese communists. My talk considers why Allied troops entered Timor before the Japanese, a little about Novocastrian commando Jeff Laidlaw, why Portuguese and Timorese were evacuated along with the commandos, and why Bob's Farm was chosen for an evacuation camp. Plus, I give a detailed account of the experiences of the evacuees in the Hunter region, embedded in the political, racial and class beliefs of the 1940s. I've made extensive use of the Port Stephens Family History Society publication Bob's Farm Cadre Camp, and also Forgotten Men, Timorese in Special Operations in World War II by Ernest Chamberlain. Also of particular use has been newspaper articles and histories of Australian commandos in Timor during the war. I must tell you, I have a personal interest in the topic. I became an activist for Timorese self-determination after the Dili massacre in November 1991. I was present at the 1999 vote for independence, and I lived in East Timor for 3 years running an NGO for women and more. But let's get on with the story. In 1941, Portuguese Timor had a population of about 460,000 Timorese, 2,000 Chinese, and 400 Portuguese, of whom 300 were administrators and soldiers, and 100 were deportados, who had been exiled to Timor by Antonio Salazar, the fascist dictator of Portugal, for anarchist and communist agitation, even throwing bombs. Although Portugal was ruled by a fascist and might have been expected to align with the Axis powers of Germany and Italy in the war, Portugal announced that the 550-year-old Anglo-Portuguese alliance remained intact. Britain did not ask for its assistance, and so Portugal adopted a stance of neutrality. Even before the Japanese entered the war, Australia and the Netherlands East Indies, which included West Timor, were concerned that Japan might take protective custody of the strategic oil-rich Portuguese colony on the eastern end of the island of Timor. Australia was especially nervous that Japan could use Timor as a base to invade Australia. When Japan bombed Pearl Harbor on December the 7th, 1941, and aligned with the Axis powers, it had no plans of alienating Portuguese neutrality. However, 2 days later, a proposal in the Australian War Cabinet was that the 22 Independent Company be sent to Timor. 22 was a commando company of specially selected rugged sportsman types who had been trained in guerrilla warfare. On 11th of December 1941, Britain's Secretary of State for Dominion Affairs secretly ordered Australia to stand by for joint action with Dutch forces to invade and take control of Portuguese Timor. The very next day, 1,400 Australian troops landed in Dutch West Timor. The Australian and Dutch commanders sailed on to Dili, the capital of Portuguese Timor, to tell the governor, Manuel de Carvalho, that as Japanese ships were in the vicinity, it was urgent that Allied troops land. After communicating with his bosses in Lisbon, the governor replied, "Unless Portuguese Timor is attacked, my forces must resist such a landing." Diplomatic courtesy was short-lived, and the Allied commanders said they were going to land their troops anyway, and that the Portuguese force was too small to stop them. So, in what one historian called Australia's blundering overreach, on 17th of December 1941, 155 Australian commandos and 260 Dutch troops, mainly Ambonese, landed unopposed on a beach just west of Dili, and by doing so brought the war to neutral Portuguese Timor. The 22 commandos divided into 3 platoons based outside of Dili to try and escape the malaria rife in the capital. B platoon was led by Captain Jeff Laidlaw. Laidlaw had been the head salesman for Ampol Petrol in Newcastle and lived in the suburb of Maryville. He had been a New South Wales junior swimming champion and surfing champion, and a country rugby league representative. His nickname, Bull, described his powerful build and demeanour. The Portuguese and Timorese were soon calling him Captain Carabao, meaning Captain Buffalo. Now, it was in Germany's interest that Portugal did not enter the war on the side of the Allies, but the Portuguese colony began to figure in Japanese strategy. So Hitler relented, and on 14th of February 1942, ordered his navy not to obstruct Japanese navy plans for as long as the Australians are sitting on Timor. So on the night of 19th of February, a Japanese task force landed in Dutch Timor, while a subsidiary force of 1,500 secured Dili and its airport. The Allied troops in the west of the island were defeated in 3 days. In East Timor, the Australian commandos relocated deeper into the mountainous territory and began to conduct guerrilla warfare against the Japanese troops, who were undefeated in the region at that time. The Australian commandos had become popular in East Timor because of their friendliness, sense of humour, payment for services, and bravery. In contrast, the Japanese began taking food without payment and abusing the Timorese women. Governor Carvalho had forbidden Portuguese officials from assisting the Allied forces, but many Portuguese did, as did many Timorese. They acted as interpreters, guides, intelligence and food gatherers. They provided Timorese ponies for transport and use of the administration's telephone system between districts, cared for the wounded, and hid the commandos from the Japanese. Jeff Laidlaw soon had Portuguese coming to fight with his platoon. These men were nicknamed the International Brigade and were mainly deportados. One, Arsenio Filippi, had initially just passed intelligence information to Laidlaw, but after his house was burnt down by the Japanese, with his Timorese wife inside, he joined the brigade. Another deportado, Alfredo dos Santos, suffered terrible leg wounds in combat against the Japanese. The commandos avoided pitched battles but were relentless in staging skirmishes and ambushes. B Platoon had observation posts overlooking Dili, so Laidlaw decided to stage a nighttime raid on the capital. They darkened their faces with charcoal and grease, and armed with Tommy guns, grenades and rifles, trekked along a dry riverbed, then a road, until they reached what they thought were Japanese barracks. After shooting up the place, they escaped without loss, claiming 20 to 30 Japanese casualties. They found out later that one of the huts they had shot up was the garrison's brothel. However, Laidlaw won a Distinguished Service Order for the attack. The Japanese began landing thousands more troops to deal with these uppity Australian commandos. Because of being colonised by Roman Catholic Portugal, East Timor had a strong Catholic presence, and the priests also helped the Australians. When an RAAF plane crashed into the mountains after bombing Japanese barracks in the town of Malbisi in August 1942, the pilot parachuted into tall grass. He survived but was badly burnt. To avoid his capture by the Japanese, Monsignor Jamie Goulart, the apostolic administrator of the Diocese of Dili, loaned his car for the pilot to be taken to Balcar Hospital, where Portuguese doctor Elvira Teles treated him. He was then hidden, and for her own safety, Elvira and her daughter joined the commandos in the bush. In September 1942, 240 commandos from 2-4 Company were shipped to the island to reinforce the Australians. It became more and more obvious to the Japanese that the Australians were being supported by a large proportion of the Portuguese as well as Timorese villagers. So the Japanese began offering payment to the Timorese to kill all whites. The Australian Force Commander, Major Callanan, asked the Portuguese officials to help deal with this serious problem. They agreed, but only if their women and children were moved to safety. Callanan radioed an appeal to Army headquarters in Australia to allow the evacuation of Portuguese families because, he said, the commandos owe their existence to the assistance given by these Portuguese. Permission was granted. The Japanese had flooded the south coast of East Timor with troops to prevent supplies and more reinforcements being brought to the Aussies, and so evacuations had to be carefully planned. The first was staged on 30th November 1942 at Betano. At 10 p.m, signals were exchanged with a 75-foot Kuru, captained by Novocastrian John A. Grant, an experienced sailor born on his father's boat. Laidlaw was on the beach to ask Grant to evacuate wounded Portuguese fighters together with 80 women and children. By 2 a.m, Grant had crammed them all onto his overloaded boat. All hands vacated their bunks for women with babies, the youngest 2 weeks old. On the morning of 2nd of December, the evacuees were transferred at sea to a corvette and taken to the safety of Darwin. With even more Japanese battalions arriving and their scorched earth policy making it difficult for the commandos to get food, the exhausted Australians were given permission to withdraw. Monsignor Goulart, who had been thrashed by the Japanese for lending his car for the Australian pilot, was worried about the threat to kill all whites, as 2 priests had already been slaughtered. He tracked down Callanan's mountain hideout and requested evacuation for 11 Portuguese priests and 2 Dutch priests who had escaped from West Timor and 20 Italian and Filipino Canossian nuns. In December 1942, a Dutch destroyer began carrying out 3 evacuations from beaches on the south coast, virtually under the noses of the Japanese. After marching for days through mountainous territory to reach the rendezvous point, sick and wounded Dutch and Australian soldiers, deportados like the portly anarchist José Godinho, the priests and nuns, the oldest an 80-year-old, and extended families of Portuguese and of Timorese who had been recruited to report on Japanese movements, were all whisked away. Laidlaw and his platoon embarked on the destroyer's second trip. On the third visit, the destroyer found no troops on the beach, but evacuated 45 Portuguese and mixed-race Portuguese Timorese, known as mestizos. For another evacuation, on 9th of January 1943, there were too many locals wanting to flee with Australians, so Major Callanan, in the spirit of the White Australia policy, ordered that only 50 pure-blooded Portuguese could go. On the hour of midnight, HMAS Arunta snuck into the beach. Women and children were embarked first, followed by wounded deportados like Arsenio Filippi and the last of the soldiers. Only about 20 Portuguese could be fitted in. 2 Portuguese men left behind suicided on the beach rather than be captured by the Japanese. So what was the significance of the Australian commandos fighting in Portuguese Timor? Vitally important for propaganda purposes, they were the only Allied troops undefeated by the Japanese, who had by then overrun Southeast Asia. They had tied up Japanese troops for nearly a year, an entire Japanese division for 6 months, preventing them from being deployed elsewhere. How the Allied presence and the Japanese occupation affected the Timorese will be discussed in a following podcast.
That brings us to the end of part 1 of Second World War links between Newcastle and Portuguese Timor, a forgotten story. But the story doesn't end there. In part 2, we'll explore what happened when over 500 evacuees, Portuguese bureaucrats and soldiers, priests and nuns, partisans, Timorese villagers and children arrived in the Hunter region and settled into a hastily prepared camp at Bob's farm. What followed was a fascinating clash of culture, class and politics in wartime Australia, and a glimpse into how compassion, suspicion and solidarity shaped their stay. Join us next week for part 2 as we pick up the story on Australian soil on Newcastle Family History Society podcast.